that this program contains some discussion of events that may cause distress. Being an informed citizen is not always easy. You want to know what's going on, to stay up to date with the big news stories that affect your fellow humans across the planet. But the non-stop headlines makes it difficult to completely understand what's happening. This is where we hope the explanation from the BBC World Service can help. I'm Anu Anand, and in this series I ask some of my BBC colleagues to help me break down big global news events, using archive recordings made on the ground to make sense of why these stories are important.
Raqqa in Syria. It's a city where mothers carry guns, along with their groceries.
Today we look at IS and ask how the Islamic State group has morphed from a brutal caliphate to a scattered movement that may yet threaten global security. This is the explanation from the BBC World Service. The BBC's Quentin Somerville is based in Beirut, Lebanon. He's reported from nearby Iraq and Syria during the emergence, the rise and fall of the Islamic State group.
In Syria, it takes a lot of confidence to replace your windows. But the damage done here isn't just to buildings. Amid the ruins, this was an IS headquarters. We find reminders of the victims, the disappeared, the lost, and the dead.
So, Quentin, what has been the impact of Islamic State on our modern world?
It's a group that emerged from the shadows. It attacked our communities across the world. Its base was the Middle East, but it was able to reach into communities. And not only that, some of our own people were a part of this enormous global terror machine, which really changed the way that the West and countries in the Middle East fought wars.
Before the US war on terror, no one had heard of the Islamic State group, also referred to as ISIS, ISIL, or just IS. But in 2003, partly in response to the attacks carried out by al-Qaeda in the US in 2001, President George W. Bush invaded Iraq. What happens once the US goes into Iraq? What is going on that gives rise to this idea of Islamic State?
One of the most striking things about Iraq, even under Saddam Hussein, who of course was a notorious dictator, was Iraq was a very developed country, I think, at the time. And the United States went in there to, as it described it, liberate the Iraqi people from that dictator. And in the process of doing that, it bust asunder Iraqi society. In a prison in southern Iraq called Camp Bucca, that was really the beginning of the Islamic State group. All of these Sunni extremists who hadn't been able to meet in public when they were at liberty were all chucked into the same prison by the Americans. And they started planning. By about 2013, 2014, they were flourishing. Iraq is mainly a Shia society, and Sunni groups over the next few years became more and more radicalised and more ostracised, and as a result of that, some of them went down the path of militancy. Iraq became a quagmire for the United States, and it suffered a lot of losses, a lot of casualties, and it laid the roots really for the Islamic State group coming later.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
It started on Monday when members of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS, surged on urban areas. Even after a night of heavy shelling echoed across Fallujah, troops and local policemen have been pushed outside the city's walls.
By January 2014, with US forces having struggled to contain ethnic tensions and to quell a Sunni insurgency, IS took a major Iraqi city, and the world began to register they were a force to be reckoned with.
I can remember standing on the road to Fallujah in Iraq, and we couldn't get into Fallujah because Fallujah had fallen. This enormous Iraqi city, which had been a core of Sunni militancy for many, many years, had been taken over by a group, and it wasn't al-Qaeda. They had a black flag. We didn't really know what they stood for. And that's one of the interesting things from the Islamic State group from the very beginning. They appeared almost completely fully formed. They took over everything instantly. They took over government, street sweeping, military defence, Obviously, they were a terror group, but they were much, much more than that.
So, Quentin, let's talk about the genesis of the Islamic State group. What were its aims?
Its aims from the beginning were to create this autonomous state which would respect Islam, as they interpreted it, a very extremist view of Islam. It would draw believers from across the world, regardless of nationality. All that was required was their commitment to that cause. But they carved it out from a large part of Syria and a large part of Iraq, and at one point they had 10 million people under their control, an area larger than Britain. And they did that through brute force and terror.
Now, a warning. What you're about to hear about IS tactics is disturbing.
They hung him from the ceiling by his arms, and then the beating started. Ahmed was just 14 when the Islamic State captured and tortured him.
In June 2014, the Islamic State group moved into Mosul, a city once famed for its mix of Christian and Muslim faiths, cinema and culture. But by now, Mosul, like much of Sunni Iraq, was weary of the US occupation.
Everybody around the world started scratching their head. This bunch of guys went in and took one of the largest cities in Iraq with barely a shot fired. And the reason why was because the Sunni population there had become incredibly disenfranchised, and the Islamic State group had seen this as fertile ground, set up a shadow government, and then in the middle of the year they drove into the city and they took it over. The Islamic State group went in there, highlighted the differences between the different communities, Sunni, Shia, Yazidi, Kurdish groups, and sowed hate between those groups, carried out vicious attacks and stoked sectarian tensions in a way that we hadn't seen in years, and they made those gaps wider and wider and wider, and then in that massive gap they created, they built their own state.
After taking Mosul, IS suddenly went from strength to strength. It took territory in neighbouring Syria. A few days later, on June 29, 2014, it announced the creation of a caliphate, or Islamic State, with self-declared authority over the world's nearly 1.5 billion Muslims. Less than a month later, it seized oil and gas fields in Syria with their lucrative profits. By August 2014, it had launched a genocide against Iraqi Yazidis, a religious and ethnic minority. Thousands of men were killed, women and children were enslaved and raped. And the brutality didn't stop there. On August 19th, the group posted a video showing the beheading of an American journalist, James Foley, missing in Syria for 2 years. Quentin later interviewed one of the IS militants involved.
So you've no remorse, there's no shame, it wasn't you.
I have many regrets, not just being here, previous to coming here. I have my regrets.
Jihadi John, his torture and his beheadings of the likes of James Foley and
I took a position.
Haynes and Alan Henning.
I took a position of not speaking of him at all, in a negative way.
Quentin, James Foley, now that was a pretty key moment when it came to the world's attention and the world's understanding of IS.
It was a kidnapping strategy, and we know that because the men responsible for it, the so-called Beatles, who were a group of British jihadists, it was their hostages who called them the Beatles because they used code names from John, Paul, Ringo for the different men who were making their lives absolute hell. And there was one in particular, Mohammed Mwazi from West London, who became known as Jihadi John, and he appeared in a video in which he beheaded first James and then a bunch of other people. You knew something big was happening then, that this group really didn't give a damn and was willing to antagonise the most powerful military nation in the world, the United States, in the most egregious fashion.
As Quentin mentioned, at its peak, the Islamic State group controlled an area about the size of Britain, spread across Iraq and Syria. And its most surprising and troubling recruits were young people, raised in liberal Western democracies. So, Quentin, what was it that was resonating with these young recruits?
They promised a paradise. They promised a state where you could be a true Muslim and you'd be given a house, you'd be given healthcare, you'd be serving your God, and you would be free from Western influence. This was an organisation that was winning. People love a winner, even one as brutal as the Islamic State group. For some people, they wanted to be a part of that, and it drew a lot of people, but there was a second aspect to it. With the Islamic State, it was entirely different. You could go online and you could chat to Islamic State group people in Raqqa and in Mosul. Not only would they tell you about the wonderful paradise that had been created in Iraq and Syria, they could also tell you how to get there. So it was accessible in a way that an extremist militant group wasn't accessible before.
In September 2014, U.S. airstrikes against IS began.
The United States and the world will simply not stand by and watch as ISIL's evil spreads. Our global coalition will succeed in eliminating the threat from Iraq, from the region, and from the world.
Soon after, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria concluded that IS had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, as the group continued to release horrific new videos of beheadings and other killings. What triggers the international response against IS?
President Obama was very reluctant to get involved in new wars, even when the enemy was as horrible and as dastardly and as cruel and vicious as the Islamic State group. So there was that constant tension about what should the United States do. They weren't going to send troops. There was a very real prospect that Iraq could have fallen. The penny finally dropped with the West, and not just this bombing campaign started, but also an international coalition came together to empower local forces in Iraq and in Syria. Because remember, when IS rolled across the border from Syria into Iraq, Iraqi forces dropped their weapons and ran away.
But the battle against IS would continue for nearly 3 more years. Before its end, blood would be shed far from the battlefields of Iraq and Syria.
In the space of a few hours, scores of people were killed in central Paris in a series of coordinated attacks. Suddenly, news spread that revellers at a rock concert here in the popular Bataclan Theatre had been taken hostage, but around 80 innocent people had already been killed.
In November 2015, IS suicide bombers hit locations around Paris, killing at least 130 people and wounding nearly 500 others. So, Quentin, what does the attack in Paris signify in terms of Islamic State's ambitions, its power, its reach?
It signified that this was a terror group like no other. It was more sophisticated, it had a greater reach than any other terror group in the world at that moment. It could mount attacks remotely, but direct them pretty much anywhere in the world. It was a shock moment for the world in terms of, this isn't just a problem for the Middle East. If we don't check this group, then there will be no rest from them, because they have the means, they have the people, and they have the determination to carry out these spectacular and awful attacks.
IS also claimed responsibility for attacks on a subway in Belgium, an airport in Turkey, a Tunisian hotel, Egyptian churches, a Bangladeshi bakery, and for multiple car bombs in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, which killed hundreds of people at a time. In February 2017, the tide began to turn against IS.
All night long, we've heard coalition aircraft and Iraqi artillery slam this area just to the north of us. Over there, it's the Iraqi flag that's flying on the airfield again. This is a landmark moment. Iraqi forces now have the Islamic State group on the run. IS might transform itself into something else, but right now, here in Iraq, we are witnessing the final days of the caliphate. In February 2017, we actually saw the real beginning of the end of the Islamic State group, because the last part of Mosul, the real hard core of where the Islamic State group were based in West Mosul, in the old city, began to fall. For me, that's when I knew they were finished.
In December of that year, the Iraqi government announced that its war against IS was over. Did you see that as the official end of IS at that point?
It was clear that the Islamic State group as a caliphate were finished. But, we weren't idiots. We knew that this was a group that had started in the shadows, in the deserts and in the mountains, and we knew that that's where they'd go back to. They're still there, but they've lost the momentum. 2, they've lost their coolness for a lot of jihadists, I think. And 3, they've lost their territory. IS is back in northern Syria. The caliphate remains, says this graffiti, terrorising and extorting the people here. This man's son was murdered by the jihadists.
Eyewitnesses said that a car started following them. It caught up with them and then they were kidnapped. They found their decapitated heads resting on the asphalt.
So where is the Islamic State group in the 2020s? What are we talking about?
So the Islamic State group is now all across Africa, West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. They've been pretty effective at expanding there, and the United States in August 2021 said that they were one of the most serious threats facing the world at the moment. They're also in Afghanistan, as too is Al-Qaeda. And some of the attacks that we're seeing now in Afghanistan are being carried out by the Islamic State group against the Taliban. So you have this strange situation where a former insurgent group is now the government and is now facing exactly the same threat that it brought to its opposition in the Afghan government. But in Afghanistan, it's a big open question.
Quentin, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That's the BBC's Quentin Somerville explaining why the fall of the Islamic State group's caliphate doesn't mean its ideas and appeal have disappeared. You've been listening to The Explanation with me, Anu Anand, on the BBC World Service. Stay up to date with the latest developments on the Islamic State group by visiting the BBC News website. And if you want to hear more episodes of The Explanation, please subscribe now on BBC Sounds.